Hello everyone, welcome to Marketing Research, MKTG 457. This is chapter 9. In this chapter, let's talk about conducting marketing experiments, doing experiments. Even though this is not required for your marketing research project, your group project, but you do need to know the in and outs of marketing experiments, experimental research, right? So after this chapter, you should be able to know the basic characteristic of research experiments, design an experiment using basic issues of experimental design, and know the tools for maximizing the validity of experiments with an emphasis on minimizing demand characteristics. Weigh the trade-off between internal and external validities. Okay? Recognize the appropriate use of test marketing, and avoid unethical experimental practices. Okay? First, experiments are widely used in causal research designs. Remember what is the causal research? Causal research design with experiment, you can establish causality, easily. Okay. The marketing experimenter manipulates one or more independent variables and holds constant all other possible independent variables while observing the effects on dependent variables. Now we're talking about the independent versus dependent variables. Let me give you an example here. As you know that sometimes let's see, the store, like retail store, right? The painting, the color of the wall of the store might have an impact on consumers' shopping behavior, right? In order to test for this, test for their willingness to shop or to purchase, and under different different color of the wall of the paint on the wall in the store, we can do an experiment. In this case, the outcome or dependent variable would be the purchase intention, for example, or willingness to shop, and the independent variable that you can manipulate as the experimenter would be the color of the wall. Right? You can adjust the color of the wall to see what color may have a bigger impact on the dependent variable. The purchase intention may be for example, maybe in hot, red, orange, warm colors of a room, of the wall in the room, people are more likely to spend their money or make purchase. Whereas if the room color is painted blue or green or cold colors, the people are not that likely. I'm just giving an example here. Okay, dependent versus independent variables and in experiment. Okay. A researcher can control variables in an experiment to a degree not possible in a survey. You can do that in an experiment. You can change the wall color of the wall, but you cannot do that, in a survey, obviously, right? So you have better control of the variables. Characteristic of experiments. Researchers, we often refer to participants in the experimental research as subjects, the human subjects, the participants. Okay? Researcher subjects the research participants to some experimental manipulation. In the example I just gave you, we manipulate the color of the room, right, to have the participant experiencing or expressing their shopping behavior in different kind of room colors, different color of rooms. Okay? Experimental conditions. What is experimental condition? An experimental condition refers to one of the possible levels of an experimental variable. Sorry, excuse me. Right? A condition refers to one of the possible levels of an experimental variable manipulation. Right? For example, different colors of the wall. Okay? That different level of the color. Okay? Blocking variables, we use categorical variables such as subject's gender or ethnicity as blocking variables to group subjects. So we want to compare, for example, the purchase intention of male versus female, or Black American versus white American, for example. Okay? Covariate. Okay? Covariate is a continuous variable expected to show a statistical relationship with a dependent variable. That's a covariate. Okay? It's a continuous variable expected to show a statistical relationship with a dependent variable. Okay? Effects. Effects are the characteristics of experiment that allow hypotheses to be tested. We want to see if there is an effect between the dependent versus independent variables. Okay, we want to see if there's an effect. When we talk about the effects, we want to talk about the main effects versus interaction effects. What's the main effect? Main effect refers to the experimental difference in means between the different levels of any single experimental variable. Like, for example, where different levels, a different color of the room, right? We want to see the purchase intention of people, shoppers, consumers in the room, right? And look at their the means of the purchase intention score. Right? We can use the Likert scale to measure that, and we look at the means of people in blue room versus in yellow room or red room, for example. And that the experimental difference in means between them is the main effect, or the effect of color on purchase intention. Okay? Interaction effect, though, is a change in the dependent variable due to specific combination of independent variable. Okay? Maybe in addition to color of the room, we want to look at also the lighting in the room, right? Maybe bright light versus dim light, right? Bright versus dimmer, right? And maybe we find that there's a combination of independent variables, lighting versus color. Maybe red bright light is produce the highest amount of purchase intention, or maybe a dim blue room, produce the lowest level of purchase intention, and that will be the interaction effect. So interaction effect is changing dependent variable due to a specific combination of independent variables. In this case, lighting and color of the room. Okay? Researchers often depict the experimental results with the line graph. We use a line graph to research that, right? When the line have different slopes, there's an interaction is likely to present. Okay. Summary of experimental characteristics. Experiments use subjects instead of respondents. When we do survey, we say we use respondents. When we conduct experiment, we use subjects. Both are, human beings involved. Okay. Experimental variables become the key independent variable. Experimental variable become the key independent variable. Okay. Experimental effects exist to the extent that the treatment groups exhibit differences between means, like purchase intentions with the different colors of room or with different level of lighting. Okay, we want to see the differences in means. Okay? There's some basic issues in experimental design. Right? Experimental designs involve no less than 4 important design elements. Okay, manipulation of the independent variable. You can manipulate the level of lighting, all right, or the different colors. Right, you can manipulate the independent variable. Selection and measurement of dependent variable. You select your dependent variable and measure that. Okay, you need that. Selection and assignment of experimental subjects. You put people in the different settings, different room color room, and to rooms with different lightings, right? And measure their dependent variable. When you can control over extraneous variables, control over extraneous variables, other variables that may have impact. Right? Okay. Manipulation of independent variables. What's manipulation of independent variable? An experimental treatment is a term referring to the way an experimental variable is manipulated. We call it experimental treatment. Okay? Categorical variables take on a value to represent some classifiable or qualitative aspect. Categorical, like gender. Variables, categorical variables. Continuous variables can take on any value. And if you use a Likert scale, say for example on attitude or opinions, from 1 to 7, we consider that kind of like almost continuous variables. Okay? And the researcher must select the appropriate level of that variable as experimental treatments. In experiment, we use experimental group and the control group. What's experimental group versus control group? Experimental group is one in which an experimental treatment is administered. A control group is one in which no experimental treatment is administered. So you have two groups, right? Experimental group, you have experimental treatment, different color of the room or different lighting of the room is applied. Control group, there's no experimental treatment administered. So you don't change the color or the lighting, okay, in the control group. Okay. More than one independent variable. An experiment can also be made more complicated by including the effects of another experimental variable. Okay. You can use a cell, to refer to treatment combination within an experiment. Cell the different variables to make up a cell. Okay. More than one independent variable. The formula for computing the number of cells is K is the number of cells in an experiment. Is T1 times T2 times T blah 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 until Tm, where K is the number of cells you need to have, and T1 is the number of treatment levels for experimental group number 1. T2 is the number of experimental level for experimental group number 2, and so forth, and through the M's experimental group, Tm, right? In my example, I just gave you, let's say you have 3 colors, red, blue, and yellow, for example, right? And the lighting, you have 2 levels, dim and bright, and dim, 2 levels. Then you have how many group cells you have? The 3 colors, 2 lighting, 3 times 2 is 6. That's 6 cells you need to have. Okay? Put people in 6 different settings, different cells. Okay. This design involves both main effect and interactions. Main effect is just the color on purchase or lighting on purchase. The interaction effect is a certain color with a certain lighting together having impact on the purchase. Okay. Selection and assignment of test units. What's test unit? Test units are the subjects whose responses to the experimental treatment are measured. Basically, you put people in the test unit in the group. Okay? Then you test their response to the treatment, right? Their purchase intention with regard to different colors or different lighting. People are the most common test units. Sample selection and random sampling. There could be random sampling errors with sample selection. Okay? Systematic or non-sampling error may occur if the sampling units in the experimental cell are somehow different than the units in another cell, and this difference affects the dependent variable. So you be careful with that. Randomization is a random assignment of subjects and treatment to groups. Okay? You can do that randomized. Yeah. Equally distributes the effects of extraneous variables because of your it's assigned to cells randomly. Okay? And matching is a technique where it involves assigning subjects in the way that the particular characteristic is the same in each group. Okay? Particular characteristic is the same in each group. For example, in each group you have equal number of men versus women, or a different number of black and white people. Okay? You can do repeated measures, experiment that expose an individual subject to more than one level of experimental treatment involve repeated measure design. You can have same person going to different levels. Okay. Extraneous variable. Extraneous variable that they're called experimental confounds. It means that an alternative explanation exists beyond the experimental variable. That's unfortunate, that in your theory or in your design, you did not consider that. So you have a confound, you have an extraneous variable. That's a confound. That means you didn't have a good design in the first place. Okay? There's an alternative explanation exists beyond what your experimental variable can explain. Okay? You need to identify the extraneous variable. Maybe is the demographic makeup of the group. Is the demographic makeup of the group the same or not? And okay, maybe demographic is the one variable you did not need to take into consideration. What did the control group do while the experimental group was receiving the treatment? Right? That could introduce some extraneous variables. Okay? Or there any significant difference between the experimental and control groups at the start? Okay? If there is, that could be extraneous variable. Okay? Even those variables and sound and even those variables that sound unusual sometimes have an effect. Okay? Demand characteristic and experiment variable. What's demand characteristic? That's an experimental design element that unintentionally provides subjects with hints about what research hypothesis is, right? So that's not good, right? If you unintentionally give them the hints about the research hypothesis, they may behave in a certain way that is not giving you the accurate description of the true situation. Okay? A demand effect occurs when demand characteristics actually affect the dependent variable. Okay? There is a demand effect. Experimental bias and demand effects. Yeah. If participants recognize the experimenter's expectation or demand, they're likely to act in a manner consistent with experimental treatment. So that's not good, right? It's archaeosis effect, right? It's no good. So even slight nonverbal cues may influence their reactions. They're keen observers. Okay? Experimenter bias occurs when an experimenter's presence, actions, or comments influence the subject's behavior or swing subjects to slant their answers and in the cooperations. Then that's not good. Okay? Now, how do you reduce demand characteristics? You incorporate experimental disguise, where logically or legally or ethically permissible, you want to incorporate experimental disguise. Okay, you can use a placebo, right? Placebo, that's a false experimental treatment. Yeah, no treatment. Okay? Placebo effect is an effect in a dependent variable associated with the psychological impact that goes along with the knowledge of some treatment being administered. Okay? See that. Or you can isolate experimental subjects. Do not let them talk to each other. Okay? You can use a blind experimental administrator. A blind administrator who does not know what the hypothesis is. Reducing demand characteristics, you can also administer only one experimental condition per subject. Okay? Only one condition per subject. Then they will not be able to tell if this is about, say, changing colors or changing lightings, okay? Or paying for performance. Paying for performance. Okay? Establishing control, constancy of conditions. Constant condition exposes subjects in all experimental groups to identical conditions, except for the differing experimental treatments. Constancy and conditions that help. Okay? Counterbalancing attempts to eliminate the confounding effects of order of presentation by requiring that 1/4 of subjects be exposed to treatment A first, 1/4 to treatment B first, 1/4 to treatment C first, and finally 1/4 to treatment D first. That way, you can act as a counterbalancing to eliminate the confounding effect of order presentation. Basic versus factorial experimental design. There is basic design versus factorial design. In basic experimental design, a single independent variable is manipulated to observe the effect on a single dependent variable. Right? Basic design, like say just one independent variable, color, not color, lighting, just color, and one single dependent variable, purchase intention. That'd be a basic design. Okay? A factorial experimental design are more sophisticated than basic design and allows for an investigation of the interaction of two or more independent variables. Like I said, dependent variable is a purchase intention. You can have two experimental variables, independent variables, lighting and color of the room. Then there could be interaction effects. Okay. Lab experiments. In a lab experiment, the researcher maximizes control over research setting and the extraneous variables. In lab, you can control them, very well. Okay. And tachistoscope allows a researcher to experiment with the visual impact of advertising and packaging, like this lady in the picture. Okay, it controls the amount of time a subject sees the visual image. You can use computers, machines to do that, control that. Field experiments. You can also conduct field experiments. Lab experiment versus field experiment. Research subjects involving experimental manipulations implemented in a natural environment. That's field experiment. Right? Not a lab experiment, but a natural environment. Subjects do not even know they have taken part in an experiment, in the field experiment. They don't even know. Right? It's a field experiment in natural environment. Consent is implied because the subjects are not asked to do anything departing from their normal behavior. So the consent is there as implied. Okay? Advantage of between subject design versus within subject design. Okay, what is between and within? Within subject design involves repeated measure because with each treatment, the same subject is measured. Same people going through different treatments, different level treatments. Okay. Between subject design is that each subject receives only one treatment combinations. Okay. What's the advantage for between? If you have a between subject design, the validity is higher. Reduce the demand characteristic. Validity is higher. Okay? And statistical analysis is simpler, makes it easier to report results if you do it with between subjects. Of course, it's also, you can imagine, more costly. Okay? More costly. There is internal versus external validity in experimental design, in experimental research. Right? Researchers always face trade-offs. You are faced with a trade-offs. You cannot have the best of both. Right? Experiments are no exceptions, and many design decisions affect an experiment's validity, whether it's valid or not. Yeah? Not all validity is created equal. No, not all validity is created equal. Okay? Internal validity. What's internal validity? Internal validity is experimental variable truly responsible for any variance in the dependent variable. You see, color affects purchase intention, right? If is an experimental, is the color truly responsible for that change in purchase intention? Right? That's the issue with internal validity. And you can do a manipulation check. What's a manipulation check? The test and experimental manipulation to make sure that the manipulation does produce differences in independent variables. Right? And check, make sure the color, different colors is indeed different. People can tell the difference, right? And the difference, the manipulation check. There is a history effect. What's a history effect? Some change other than the experimental treatment occurs during the course of experiment that affects dependent variable. Some change other than the experimental treatment occurs during the course of experiment may affect dependent variables that we call the history effect. There's also the cohort effect. A cohort effect is change in the dependent variable that occurs because the members of one experimental group experience different historical situation than the ones in other experimental group. Right? It's a cohort effect. Oh, maturation is also affecting internal validity. That's a function of time and naturally occurring events that coincide with growth. Right? That's maturity. Testing effect is a nuisance effect occurring when the initial measurement or test alerts or primes subjects in a way that affects their response. Okay? That's the testing effect. Then there's the instrumentation effect, a nuisance that occurs when a change in procedures causes change in the dependent variables. That's the instrumentation. And selection effect. That's a sample bias that results from the differential selection of respondents for the group. And a sample bias resulted from the different selection of respondents for the group. That's the selection bias. Okay? And mortality bias occurs when some subjects will die or will withdraw from the experiment before it's completed. Mortality. And also there is the issue of external validity. What is external validity? External validity is the accuracy with which the experimental results can be generalized beyond the experimental subjects. Okay, this is effects or the results, right, be generalized, to outside this experimental subject, experimental group. We call them external validity, right? Because sometimes we use convenient subjects. Right? Behavior experiments often involve the use of convenient subjects rather than individual randomly selected. And if I use my students in my class as subjects, that be a convenient subjects, right? And that may not be should have good external validity because it's different from other the people in the general public. Okay? Students are easily accessible, but they often are not representative of the total population, as you can see. Okay? Crowdsourcing is what participants has drawbacks, including expertise bias and acquiescence bias. Acquiescence bias. Crowdsourcing. There's a trade-off between internal and external validity. Yeah. Ideally, researcher could balance internal and external validity by using both experimental approaches. And results from lab experiments will be followed up with some type of field test. And you can balance external with external validity. Test marketing. Test marketing is the most common field experiment. Okay. The three broad uses of that: forecasting new product success. You have new product, you want to see if it's going to be successful, you conduct a test marketing, a field experiment. A product market is marketed on a small scale under actual market conditions, a small scale. Right? Testing the marketing mix. What is marketing mix? 4 Ps. Right? You can test if your marketing mix variable is good. A manager can study an element of marketing mix with the test market, either price, product, promotion, or place. Identifying product weaknesses. The weakness in the product can be identified through a field experiment or test market. Okay? Also allows identification of previously undetected product or marketing plan. Okay? Advantages and disadvantages of test marketing. Advantage of test marketing, you can see real world test setting, okay, test market, and the research can easily communicate results to management. Okay? But there are disadvantages of test marketing. Cost is the issue, cost is the issue, and time is another one. Right? Lots of secrecy. Once you test market it, everyone knows. Your competitor knows also. Okay? There are ethical issues in experimentation. The question of deceptions there. When is it right to deceive? When is it right to deceive? To what degree do you deceive? Right? The question of deception. Researchers should debrief experimental subjects following an experimental procedure because it returns the subject to their normal state. And you should debrief them after that. Okay? After that, following the experiment. The issue of test markets and efforts extended towards interfering with the competitor test market, that'd be good. That'd be a big issue here. And you do not want to mess with your competitors' test market, give them false information. Okay? That's it. That's all I have for this chapter. As a group project again, continue to work on identify the company's business and come up with the research questions and research objective. Right? Research design, of course, is a survey, and you need to consider sampling issues. I'll send more announcements in the class. Okay, and that's it. And thank you. I'll see you next time.